Hello, my name is Dr. Lewis Hoffman of Saybrook University, and this video lecture is on a framework for understanding the psychological dimensions of poetry. This lecture is originally being created for a class on poetry, healing, and growth. However, I wanted to present it in an open access format that could be available to other people outside the class that may be interested in it. We're going to be covering a number of topics in brief in this course. We're not going to go into great depth with each of these. The purpose is more to explore the psychological dimensions of poetry and to kind of plant the seeds of it. With each of these, we could go into much greater depth, but again, just wanting to generate some thinking about the psychological dimensions of poetry with this. One of the first ways we can look at poetry from a psychological perspective is in terms of catharsis. Catharsis, going back to Freud, is really the idea of an emotional release. It's not really a processing or creating meaning. It's more of just a release. And while it may provide some temporary relief or help, it doesn't really solve the problems. So for example, from a therapy perspective, some clients will come in and the primary way that they will use therapy, particularly at first until guided by the therapist, is this catharsis. They just release. However, this can be actually a problem and can encourage a dependence upon therapy because the clients need to come in and get this emotional release to take the edge off their emotions, to get out these pent-up emotions, but they're not really making the deeper changes that will help lead to the type of changes that they're seeking by coming to therapy. But at the same time, catharsis can be a helpful element. For example, find often that if I were to go on vacation for a couple of weeks and maybe a client is at a difficult spot, when we first meet again, the client may have some pent-up emotions from that time, particularly if it was a difficult period during that time, and they may need to begin by getting a little bit of a release, a little bit of a catharsis, and able to take the edge off the emotions so that they're able to approach them and experience them and talk about them in a more meaningful way that can lead to insight, into changes, and into creating meaning in their life. Now, it's rare that a poem will only serve the purpose of catharsis. However, this often may be one dimension of poems. Poems can serve many different purposes at the same time. Poetry can also be a form of intrapersonal communication. Intrapersonal communication is, for example, communication with oneself. So it can be a form of self-talk, of journaling, or communication within oneself. And this can be done for a variety of different purposes. It may be done for creative expression, just for the purpose of creativity in and of itself. That creativity often is meaningful. It's often rewarding just as an end in itself. It may be used to preserve a memory, somewhat similar to what a photograph would do, or similar to what more of a narrative form of journaling might do. But poetry is going to bring a different element to it. That it might, because it's able to capture some of the different emotions, it's going to bring some of the different emotional aspects into the memory. So for example, one of the poems that I wrote that is particularly meaningful to me was about a time when my mother was very sick. And I didn't know if my mother was going to survive or make it. And I wanted to remember some of the emotions I had, some of the experiences I had when flying back and forth to be with my mother while she was very sick. And so I wrote some poems that were able to really capture this for me and really remember some of the important dimensions of that for me. A picture wouldn't have fully done it. Writing a narrative in a journal wouldn't have fully done it. The poem was the way that it could best preserve that memory for myself. And I often find that when I am journaling, it will, particularly during a time of transition and when I'm trying to figure out the meaning of a transition, journaling will often lead to a poem. Some of the lines of the poem may begin as part of the narrative in the journal entry, and gradually it changes into a poem. And there's some other ways that poetry can be a part of interpersonal communication, to process emotion, facilitate insight, create meaning. But I'll get to these a little bit later. As is evident, poetry can also be a form of interpersonal communication, a way to express one's ideas, and it can be in a number of forms here. It can be to another person. A common example of this can be love poetry. At one point in my relationship with my wife, I wrote her a short book, just a handwritten little book that included a number of poems and also some letters to go with the poems. And this was something that was very meaningful in our relationship. It was able to express something very personal and intimate in our relationship and really deepen our connection with each other in a lot of different ways. So in this sense, the poems were a very powerful form of communication to another person. It can also be a part of expression to a group. That I frequently use poems as part of teaching in a class. For example, in particular, I often use poetry in talking about empathy, as I think poems can be a great way to deepen empathy, experience empathy, learn about empathy, teach empathy, enhance empathy. So poems often are an important part of teaching about empathy for me. And it also can be to an audience or society at large. This can be a part of using poems for social change or activism, which has been a growing interest of my own. How can we use poems to impact others and inspire others to try and make change in the world and to bring people together around a cause. But it also can be more in just that creative element or even a healing element. To encourage people to reflect on issues. So there's a lot of different ways that it can be used to society at large. And this is a lot of what poets that are professional poets try and do, is write to an audience or society at large, but they often will have some other poems and other types of poems too. And as is illustrated in some of these examples, part of what this does is it communicates what can otherwise be communicated. And I'll often find when I have difficulty communicating something to someone that a poem can do it better than what just a narrative can, and just what my words can in another format. And I found this in a number of different relationships. It can also be a succinct form of communication because it crams a lot of meaning into a small space. It can be just a creative form of communication, just to express creativity, and creativity it can be a reward in and of itself. And there can be a number of other varied purposes that we'll get to later in the lecture as well. Then, from a psychological perspective, a very important aspect of poetry is how it relates to the unconscious and insight. Poems tend to rely upon complex symbols and metaphors that may have many meanings compacted into a small space, and many meanings compacted into a single symbol. So poems often emerge partially and maybe even largely from the unconscious, because the unconscious is able to create these types of complex symbols. For example, if we were to look at a pen, what could be the different symbolic elements of a pen? Well, we can think of it, one, just as writing, as a way of expression. We could also think of the pen as a part of one's identity. The idea of taking up the pen, taking up one's pen, has been used to convey the idea of taking a pen to use writing for a particular cause. So it can serve many different purposes. We can think of a pen as opposed to a pencil as putting something down more permanently. Now, it's possible that this one symbol, the pen, when used by itself or in a poem or another form of communication or even a dream, it might be combining all of those different forms of meaning at once. So it may have multiple meanings at the same time. And it's also possible that the author may not know, or at least fully know, the meaning of a symbol of a poem. So the author might have one idea for the meaning of this in mind, but the unconscious may be drawn to the symbol because of all the other different meanings that can come at it. A poem may also change meaning over time, even for the author. Now, one of the more obvious ways is that, for example, I may write a poem, I may have some different experiences when I come back to the poem. Now I can bring a different meaning to the poem that wasn't there at the beginning. However, the poem meaning can also change over time because we more fully understand it. and we understand the nuances of it, so it brings different types of meaning to the surface. We can also think about using poem to facilitate insight. So we may take a poem, write it, set it aside, and when we come back to it later, we find these different elements to it that we didn't recognize there at first. Again, this may be that unconscious, and so when we come back to it, we may see meanings that we didn't know were there to help us better understand ourselves and what we were getting at when writing this poem. So a poem then can have many meanings, and this is very similar to dreams and dream interpretation. Because of all these different ways that we combine multiple meanings into a singular symbol, as we unpack it, then we can see it start to take on many different meanings, and it can become very expansive as we look at the different meanings. And so we should be cautious in interpreting a dream because when we interpret a dream or a poem, because we don't want to ever shut off possible meanings. That when we assume we found the meaning of a poem, when we fully understand it, then we've closed off possible meanings that might be there and we haven't found yet. And so we can approach poems then similar to how we approach dreams, looking for these multiple meanings that may be embedded. But it's also good to be cautious or when we interpret other people's dreams, or at least to be humble. When we interpret other people's poems, because there may be these multiple meanings and we may be missing it when we look at it. So one of the ways that we can approach dream interpretation, for example, Stanley Krippner will talk about interpreting dream interpretation through the idea of coming at it as if this were my dream. So if someone shares a dream with me, I might think about, well, if this is my dream, this is how I would experience it. This is what it might mean to me. And through doing that, the dreamer might find new aspects of what the poem or dream may mean to them, and I may be able to bring my own meanings to it as well. So this can be a way to look at possible meanings in dreams and expand upon possible meanings of dreams without imposing a meaning upon, without interpreting someone else's poem or dream. There's also an approach to poems and art that artists will often take that may be relevant here. That many artists are hesitant to provide their interpretations of their art because it discourages others from bringing their own meanings to it. Bringing their own meanings to it does a number of things. It makes it more personal and meaningful. And this can be good for even just the promotion and sales of art. That when people bring their own meaning to a song, and it becomes more and more meaningful to them from these meanings that they maybe are largely projecting upon that song, they're more likely to buy it and they're more likely to encourage other people to buy it. So there's a marketing aspect we can think about with that. But I think there's also a meaning aspect, that if we want people to connect deep meaning, and I think of that as a primary purpose of art, is to help people connect to their own meaning and possible meanings, then to be cautious in interpretation is important. So I'll sometimes talk about the meaning of my poems, but when I do it, I often encourage people to be able to bring their own meanings as well. So we've already been pointing into this idea of poems and mystery. And we've looked at it from the idea of not fully understanding it. But with mystery, I want to come at it from a little bit of a different angle. You may find that there are times in your life where you've been drawn to a poem, or maybe to a song, or a movie, and you just find yourself drawn back and back to thinking about it, or listening to it, or reading it, or watching it, and you're not fully sure why. And I think when this happens, it's often because on an unconscious level, we're connecting with a meaning that we haven't quite gotten on a conscious level yet. This is part of, again, of that symbolic element of it, and it can be part of the wisdom and conscious. So when I find myself drawn back and back to a poem or back and back to a song, I'm not sure why, I generally assume that there's a meaning to it, and there's a reason I'm being drawn back to it. It's not this grand mysterious thing of the poem communicating to me, but I often think of it more as I'm resonating with something that I need to find within myself. And that's why I'm drawn to it. So I'll keep coming back to the poem or the song or the movie, thinking about it or engaging with it to see if it may illuminate something. So this is another psychological way we can look at it. We can also look at poems as phenomenology. Phenomenology is a branch of philosophy and psychology that is largely looking at people's experience. And poems often are a reflection or expression of someone's experience, again, in a unique way that we maybe cannot capture from other directions. So this is similar to what we talked about in preserving memories and some other things, that poems can really be a form of doing phenomenology in some ways. Well, then we can think of poems as processing. And we talked about before, catharsis, just expression, just getting it out, getting rid of it. But processing entails something more. And we can think of different elements of processing. Generally, processing includes an emotional element where we're experiencing emotion, a cognitive element where we're thinking about it, and then it moves towards creating some type of insight or meaning. So processing has that emotional element to it, but it takes us to something more. It's not just expression, it's not just experience, it's bringing meaning to it. And so poetry is meaning then. It captures meaning that exists, but it also helps for us to create meaning from what seems to be meaningless. So poetry in the face of tragedy, for example, it's a way that we bring meaning to something that otherwise might be meaningless. It may be, the meaning may be that we capture the depth of pain that happened in a tragedy to try and inspire people to prevent this type of tragedy from happening again. So it may not be that we're bringing forth meaning or finding meaning that is already there. We may be creating meaning. At other times we may be finding meaning that's inherent in what occurred, but at other times we may be creating it. But meaning often comes out of the result of processing an aspect of a poem. So as a poem helps us process an event, we move towards capturing or understanding meaning. And from an existential psychology perspective, this is quite key because meaning really is what it's all about in some ways. That, Frankl talks about that suffering ceases to be suffering when we find a meaning. And we'll often find that when we capture that meaning, something changes. I'll get to a little bit more about that in a minute. So this can be a very critical aspect, the meaning aspect. And then we can talk about this emotional shift. So poetry at times may result in a significant emotional shift. This may occur right at the time the poem is finished. It may occur somewhere along the writing of it, or even capturing the idea that then becomes the poem, or maybe somewhere down the line. Some of this may be the catharsis or the release, and some of it may be the processing, but often it's the insight and the meaning, the capturing. So, for example, I've talked about in other video lectures that a poem that I wrote the night that my dog died. And when I wrote this poem, and this is a dog that I loved very deeply and was a very important part of my life. When I wrote this poem, when I finished it, I could feel a significant emotional shift. It wasn't that the sadness went away, that the grieving was done, but it was a very important part of that process. It captured something for me. It created a meaning, and it changed the way I experienced Amaya, my dog's death, in a very profound way. So poetry can do that. And with all of these ways that I'm talking about poetry, it's not just poems. We can apply this to other forms of art too, but they can help create these types of shifts. Sometimes, like the poem I wrote for Amaya, it was a fairly dramatic shift. I could really feel a significant change inside myself at the end of this poem. And I've had that with a number of different poems that I've written. But other times it may be more gradual, but it can create this change in how we experience emotions. Poetry and purpose. Now, purpose is similar to meaning, and we can talk about it basically as the same thing sometimes. But I'm using a different way of thinking about purpose here, a different aspect of the idea of purpose here. When I'm talking about purpose, I'm talking about intent, what the poet seeks to accomplish, or what the reader of the poem seeks to accomplish by engaging it. We may not always know this, Yet the poem and the unconscious may sometimes have a different purpose than the conscious mind of the poet. So again, we may see that there's different elements to it. And we may have a conscious intention of a poem going in one direction and it's going to change gradually to another. But I think it's something that we need to be aware of and think about when we're writing poem and when we're reading poem. Is what is the intent of this poem? Was it to heal? Was it to grow? Was it to inspire? Was it to promote change in others? Was it just for oneself? These can help us gain some better insight into the poem and how we might be able to use the poem. But I think also we don't want to be bound by that at the same time. I think it's nice that when we create a poem, if we can set it free in the end, if we can let the poem begin to take on its own meaning, its own life. And as it does this, it may mean many different things, but the poem may go on quite an adventure of its own in this way. The poem may go on an adventure of finding new meanings in different people's lives that the original poet may never expect it on its own. And when we can send a poem off to this freedom, I think it's a wonderful and exciting thing. So some of the purposes, we mentioned a lot of these, but I mentioned this to think about ways, motivations you may have for writing poetry as well. So you might think about these as your inspirations. It may be to describe, kind of that phenomenological, to express or communicate to oneself or to others, to inspire others. I think this is what a lot of poetry is intended to do, is to inspire others to make changes in themselves or changes in the world. Maybe to promote healing of oneself or healing in others. May to help oneself grow or to promote growth in others. It may be for social change or activism to, again, inspire others to go out and make a difference in the world. It may to bring people together, and that may be connected with a lot of these different things, the healing, the growth, the activism. If we can bring people together around a poem, it can have a more powerful impact. And there's many, many other purposes that we can bring to poetry. This is just a starting point. So again, this is not intended to be a comprehensive overview of the psychological dimensions of poetry, but rather to stimulate thinking about the psychological dimensions of poems. And I would hope that everyone who watches this video lecture is able to think about and bring some of their own psychological dimensions to poetry that have not been talked about in this brief lecture. Thank you.